Thank you, Mr. President. I have to tell you, when I am back home, I am struck by one of the things I'm hearing in Tennessee, and it's this odd mix of optimism and also of concern. And Tennesseans are very concerned that we are not going to pass another round of COVID relief in time to help save their businesses, in time to help people who lost their job through no fault of their own. And on the other hand, they're excited about the fact that we finally have vaccines that are going through the process, that are getting to communities. There are vaccinations taking place. And I have thought, you know, this is really an interesting mix of emotions, especially with Christmas right around the corner. And Sunday, after I had visited with some folks, I thought, you know, this, I think, is where people are going to be for a while. Some are very optimistic, some are incredibly worried, but there is one thing that is a constant. And I've really watched this grow over the last several months. It is the confusion and the anger that is directed at the Chinese Communist Party. And quite frankly, this is something that I fully believe has reached a boiling point with Tennesseans and with the American public. Tennesseans were familiar with the tense relationship between China and the U.S. well before they found themselves in the middle of this pandemic. Here's a good example. At this point, most everyone is familiar with China's notorious disregard for intellectual property rights. But when I first started working on this issue in the House with songwriters back in Tennessee, and it was in the early 2000s, we felt like we were fighting that battle all alone. We had to fight with Chinese officials and eventually were able to establish some initial royalty rates payable to U.S. copyright owners whose sound recordings are broadcast in China. That was a solid win, but the fact that we had to fight so hard for something so simple really was frustrating. And people in Tennessee have not forgotten that frustration. Before this year, they were painfully familiar with the Chinese government's abysmal human rights record. That initial footage of massive protest in Hong Kong had resurrected memories of Tiananmen Square and reminded everyone that the Chinese government still uses political violence, speech suppression, and torture to silence dissent. The people I talked to had read about diplomatic tensions and trade deals, and they could sense that in spite of all those optimistic perspectives on the nightly news, our biggest rival in Asia had become our adversary. So they weren't at all shocked when news reports started rolling in that the Chinese Communist Party officials in Hubei province in Beijing had done nothing, not one thing, to stop the spread of the novel coronavirus. Since then, Tennesseans and indeed most Americans have received a valuable education, courtesy of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. We learned that the Chinese government's failure to sound the alarm wasn't an anomaly, it was intentional. Neither was there strong arming of the World Health Organization or the incarceration and torture of doctors and journalists who defied gag orders to blast out warnings to anyone who would listen. They tried to tell us this was reaching a pandemic, and they were punished. And as they look around at the economic ruin in their communities as small businesses are shuttered and independent music venues are boarded up for the long haul, all those puzzle pieces are falling into place, and quite frankly, they are justifiably upset. I would venture to say many of them are absolutely furious with what the Chinese government has done. By now, we understand this is what the Chinese Communist Party does. As a government, as an all-powerful political organization, and as a group of rabid ideologues from whom acts of genocide flow as easily as the propaganda posted to their many official Twitter accounts, this is all a part of their quest for global dominance, and their success depends on gaining complete control over speech, thought, resources, and their relationships with other nations. This is the Chinese Communist Party's master plan. When Xi Jinping took power in 2012, there were a lot of optimistic pundits out there who thought that he would embrace transparency and liberal economic policies, but oh my goodness, have they ever been wrong. In fact, he styled himself in the image of Mao, creating a personality cult that equates attacks on Xi with challenges to the legitimacy of party rule. It's all about him. Anyone who is open to history book knows this doesn't bode well for diplomatic efforts to rebalance power. This isn't my political opinion. This is the reality that diplomats, members of the defense community, and policy experts accept as a matter of fact. The Senate Armed Services Committee accepted this reality when we drafted the bipartisan 2021 NDAA. This year's bill contains the most substantial action we've ever taken to counter Chinese aggression and great power competition. It establishes the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, which will help the military enhance defense capabilities in the region and reaffirms our commitments to Taiwan, India, Vietnam, and Japan, and other allies and partners geographically near China. We drafted numerous provisions to keep U.S. intellectual property, technology, and data out of Beijing's grasp by limiting funding for universities that host Confucius Institutes and restricting defense industrial base employees from working for Chinese-owned companies. Why did we do this? Because we have learned. Not only is this part of China's propaganda, this is where they are embedding their spies. In 2021, we'll take major steps to secure our supply chain and invest in American innovation to maintain our technological advantage. We paid particular attention to accelerating the development of 5G networks that are needed by our troops in the field, and to complement that expansion, enhancing our nation's cybersecurity strategy. The Chinese Communist Party isn't just playing politics on Twitter. Their tactics pose a very real threat to our nation's security and that of our allies and our partners. I've spoken at length about how badly we need to unravel our relationship with China. I've examined problems related to our medical supply chains, security issues in the building blocks of popular technology, and sourcing for rare earth elements. Reclaiming these critical resources will take time and investment, but it can be done, and I will continue to fight for this as we move into the next Congress. But I want to consider just for a moment a few examples of this entanglement that hit particularly close to home and really give a sense of how much private companies and organizations compromise just to maintain access to the Chinese marketplace. Earlier this year, the PR professionals at the NBA worked some serious overtime after an investigative report published by ESPN showed that the Chinese Communist Party affiliated coaches at the league's training facilities in Xinjiang were abusing players. That is correct, abusing players. Initial reports of this abuse were ignored by NBA officials. Keep in mind that these training facilities existed in the same region as those concentration camps used to imprison the Uyghur Muslims and others guilty of thought crimes against the Chinese Communist Party. So, what was the NBA doing there in the first place? How could something like this actually happen? Here's the reason. Communist China plays host to an estimated $4 billion NBA market. They say that China is basketball obsessed, and NBA execs have used every avenue they can to take advantage of that $4 billion market. And they jealously protect those relationships, even if it means using skyrocketing sales numbers to explain away the blind eye they've turned to the CCP's crimes against humanity. They're not alone. Walt Disney. This fall, Disney released the live-action version of Mulan and caught some well-deserved hell after sharp-eyed rights activists combed through the credits and discovered that filmmakers chose to shoot scenes for the movie in where? Xinjiang. Knowing that they'd have to cooperate with who? The Chinese Communist Party's propaganda flacks to get the kind of footage they wanted to play to their desired Chinese audience. Netflix also ran afoul of human rights activists when they inked an adaptation deal with an author who parrots Chinese Communist Party propaganda and made racist comments about the persecuted Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. None of these scenarios involved high-stakes diplomatic negotiations. No one involved was on a mission to balance the geopolitical scales at all cost. They did, however, stand to net a tidy profit by maintaining friendly relations with the Chinese Communist Party. But did they ever stand up and defend the Uyghur Muslim minority? No, they did not. When faced with such manipulation on a global scale, Tennesseans expect accountability. They want news reports and hearings and absolute condemnation. But that's not what they get. Instead, they get regurgitated propaganda transmitted directly from the CCP, peppered with media buzzwords and distilled into sound bites. Our attempts to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable for covering up the origins of the pandemic were met with baseless accusations of xenophobia, of racism. I've met similar resistance when speaking truth to power about the CCP's aggression in Tibet, Mongolia, the concentration camps in Xinjiang, and the arbitrary detention of the Hong Kong freedom fighters. Prominent members of the press, pundits, and even members of Congress who have access to more than enough information to know better, all provide cover for the Chinese Communist Party at the expense of American lives and livelihoods. It's all there in black and white. They're failing an open book test because they are refusing to admit that their coziness with China does not serve the American people or our allies well. This situation will not evaporate with the start of the new Congress. Vaccines and defense funding and new technology will solve some immediate problems. They're not a strategy. Those are action items. We must all commit right now to an aggressive strategy that leads a whole-of-government approach to protecting American intellectual property, to securing our critical supply chains, and bringing our manufacturing back home. We must assert our role as a leader on the global stage and stand between the Chinese government and leadership roles in international organizations. How is it that China could have a seat on the Human Rights Council of the United Nations? Look at what they're doing to the Tibetans, to the Taiwanese, to the Hong Kong freedom fighters, to the Uyghur Muslims. And we should continue to provide support for Hong Kong and for Taiwan, build a strong network of allies and partners across the Indo-Pacific. And we should increase our defense investment in the Indo-Pacific Command. I laid out more items in a white paper I released earlier this year. It's online, blackburn.senate.gov. It's time to pay attention to everything the CCP is doing. In today's New York Post, I had an op-ed that lays out how they're using Twitter to troll and intimidate the rest of the world into staying silent. And you know what? They're unfortunately, having some success with that. World leaders, powerful corporations, celebrities are all scared into silence by online propaganda campaigns. And Mr. President, I would ask that a copy of my op-ed be included in the record with these remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you. If they can do that with a hashtag, all of that suppression, all of that intimidation, then think about what they'll do in the real world. If we stand down, the Chinese government is going to keep pushing to stand up. They will fill a power vacuum because their determination is to be the leader, the global dominator. They want the 21st century to be the China century. It is their strategy. It is what they do. So now is the time to act, and I would encourage my colleagues to remember this as we begin a new Congress. I yield the floor.